Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. Really pleased to have John Rubino with us once again. And as most of you know, John runs the popular financial website dollarcollapse.com, which I think you should really bookmark if you haven't already. Go there every day. John usually has an article or several articles every day that are very, very important in terms of keeping up with what is actually happening in the world, as opposed to what you might hear from some of the mainstream sources. John, thanks for joining me again.
Oh, good to talk to you again, Jay.
Yeah, so we've had a nice breakout in gold. I know you own gold shares. I know you're very much invested in senior mining companies to an extent, and you were telling me that you had written some covered calls. That's good for cash flow, of course. But what do you make of this? Now, I titled today's show, we have Currency Wars, Rocket Fuel for Gold, and I noticed the other day that, the Europeans, Draghi doing whatever it takes to keep the euro, the Eurozone from falling apart, trying to keep some economic growth there, if not very much, at least to keep things, the wheels from falling off the wagon. He's been doing whatever it takes, creating money out of nothing in the euro dollars. But of course, that means that the U.S. dollar then is more expensive relative to the euro, and it makes it harder for Mr. Trump to make America great again, as he would like us to believe he's doing. So do you think that the currency wars maybe are starting, currency and trade aspects are starting to play into the bullish scenario for gold?
Well, it's all part of the same story. When you borrow way too much money, economic growth going forward gets harder and harder for various reasons. Debt is just inherently deflationary. So governments start trying things to keep the party going when they've got too much debt. And one thing they can do is to ramp up their own spending. But that has effects, their interest costs go up, so that kind of cancels out the benefit of ramping up spending with borrowed money after a certain point. So they try something like a trade war, like we're doing now with the rest of the world. And that has a lot of negative side effects. So then they start trying to push the value of their currency down, because that improves their balance of trade without having to impose tariffs on their neighbors. And we're starting to do that now around the world. You're seeing China take really aggressive steps to liquefy its economy, which is way over indebted and growing too slowly, et cetera, et cetera. And that's pushing down the value of the yuan, which cancels out the effects of the tariffs we're putting on China. And same thing with Europe. So this is all part of the same story, where we're trying different things to grow in the face of an outrageous amount of debt. So a currency war is absolutely in the cards, in the sense that we all have to push down the value of our currencies or die. Inflate or die is now the dominant theme of governance in the developed world. So we have to try various ways of inflating, which is to say making our currencies worth less. So it's not a shooting war where we're targeting specific enemies and trying to destroy them. It's a fight for financial survival, where we're trying to push down the value of our currencies in order to sell more goods abroad, bring in more money, and survive through the next election cycle. So the effect of it, though, is kind of warlike, where one country does it and that impacts their trading partners, who then have to respond in kind. And we're going to see that going forward, just because there are no choices left. These guys don't have the choice of growing steadily, organically, and sustainably anymore. All they can do is try to squeeze a little bit more growth out of experimental and generally dysfunctional monetary and fiscal policies. So that's where we are.
Isn't it? It sounds to me an awful lot like what the textbooks say happened in the 1930s.
Yeah. In the 1930s, we had a huge credit boom in the 1920s. So all the debt we took on began to cause trouble, which led governments to, for instance, in the U.S., we imposed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was a big trade war instrument, big tariffs imposed on our trading partners. And that caused international trade to contract, which slowed down global growth even further, and in effect just made things worse. And it gave us the Great Depression. So we're heading that way now, with one big difference. Back then we were on the gold standard, or a quasi-gold standard, depending on the country, which means money was real And governments didn't really have the option of just inflating away their debt by making their currency worth less and less and less each year. Now we have that ability. We're all running fiat currency regimes now, which are basically unlimited credit cards for governments. So they are able, at least in theory, to push interest rates to insanely low levels and to create huge amounts of new currency. And in that way, make their money worth less and less, which makes their debt easier to manage because they're paying off their debt with depreciated currency. So we have that option now. We don't have to drop into a 1930s style depression, which would probably be the best case scenario for us because that at least would get rid of the bad debt in a hurry. Mm-hmm. But what these guys are going to try to do at least is to devalue their currencies in a manageable way. And that term manageable is really the key here because it's not manageable. Once it gets going, people front run it because they see what's happening. So if you see your currency lose value year after year and you conclude that it's the government's policy to keep that going to the horizon, basically, then you act accordingly. You borrow as much money as you can. You buy the biggest house that you can, and you invest the rest of your debt-driven cash into real assets, and that causes a hyperinflation, basically. So, yeah, the governments get a depreciating currency, but they get it in a discontinuous way where it just falls off the table, and all of a sudden it's not worth anything. That's the Weimar Germany model. So, we've got two big historical models right now to look at. One is the Great Depression, and the other is the Weimar hyperinflation of the 1920s. One of those is our future, more or less, with some modern updates for new technology and stuff. It's not completely clear which one of those we'll end up with, but it is clear that we're trying for the Weimar model. At least, we're doing the things that will lead to the Weimar model by trying to depreciate our currencies at a steady, sustainable rate. Yeah. So whether we succeed or not is still up in the air because this stuff is experimental. A lot of what we're doing to get there, negative interest rates and massive deficits forever and quantitative easing where governments just buy a bunch of assets from the financial market with newly created currency. See, that's all new stuff. So it's in the nature of an experiment that the outcome isn't determined yet. You might think you know what's going to happen, but until you actually run it, you can't know for sure. And that's what we're going to do. Over the next decade, we're going to run that experiment and see what happens. And I suspect the outcome is going to be really, really messy, which leads to gold, which is the ultimate antidote for a messy world.
Well, it does, John, but let's suppose, the people that have been gold bugs, that have been buying gold shares and what have you, things collapse and those values surge in terms as measured by a worthless monetary currency. What are the chances of people being able to hang on to that wealth without government confiscating it?
Well, that's one of the big risks when you're in the minority who made the right decisions in a society that's spinning out of control, because they see you as somehow stealing that money.
Right.
And they will come after it. Not because they necessarily think it's the right thing to do, but because they're desperate. They need cash from somewhere. And there are all kinds of examples of that throughout history where, there's a civil war or there's some other kind of revolution going on or there's a financial crisis and the government goes after the people who have identifiable wealth. Like Willie Sutton, the bank robber, said when asked why he robs banks, he said, well, that's where the money is. Well, governments will go after the money that is available when the time comes. And yes, if gold is $10,000 an ounce and silver is $200 an ounce, they're liable to say, wow, look how much you made at the expense of the people who lost their jobs, blah, 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 and they'll try to take some of it away. So the corollary to investing in real assets in a time of financial chaos is diversification. You need to spread your capital around in a way that raises the odds that some of it will survive when things get really crazy. And, geographic diversification is one thing where you put some gold and silver bars in a vault in another country, for instance. And
for example,
yeah. And Diversification within the hard asset class category is another, where you buy some farmland or a good piece of real estate or, an oil well or something like that. You just want to own a lot of things and hope that a big chunk of what you own makes it through what's coming.
And keeps in your hands. Well, during the 30s, of course, gold shares worked out very well for people. They were allowed to own them. They were allowed to keep them. And Homestake, for example, went up, I think, about 8-fold at one point, while the Dow actually lost almost 90% of its value. And Homestake paid huge dividends, too, by the way. It was absolutely a savior for people at that time. But who's to say we'll have anything like the same kind of a protection for wealth or the respect for private property that we had in the 1930s? It seems with this group of leftists running for president in the Democratic Party, you wonder if there's anybody around that will respect the rights of private property going forward. But that's another issue. John, you mentioned desperation. People do things out of desperation. I'm wondering, in terms of geopolitics, if the United States isn't acting a bit out of desperation now. The United States has to have control of the oil markets to an extent to underpin its dollar. We have the petrodollar. It was set up by Kissinger and Nixon after they removed gold from the currency. And, of course, we have this arrangement with Saudi Arabia still. And the Saudis and the Iranians don't get along too well. They're sort of at odds in the Middle East. And you wrote a very interesting article a couple of days ago, June 17th to be exact. Will a false flag Iran war cause a financial crisis? Maybe just take a minute to talk about the repercussions and why we may be getting involved in a war with Iran. It seems so stupid because every war we get involved with seems to create more chaos, more uncertainty, and more danger for the world, actually, with Iraq and Libya and other places. But what are your thoughts about geopolitics and how that may play in to all the rest of what's going on, and as well as the gold price, for example?
Yeah. Well, if there's one thing to understand about today's world, it's the history of false flag attacks. Going as far back as you want to in history, you find instances of governments staging some kind of an incident and then blaming it on a would-be enemy and using that as an excuse to declare war. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. has done it. That's how we started the Vietnam War. That's how we started the Spanish-American War. And there are many, many other instances of stuff like that in the intervening years. And other countries do the same thing. So the scary implication of that is that no matter what we see on the news, we can't know if it's true. Right. Because the big governments of the world have a history of lying about stuff like this and using it as a pretext for war. So what's going on with Iran right now? By the way, before we get to Iran, it's pretty clear, I think, that the U.S. doesn't understand the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And the guys in charge seem to think they do. But everything they do, like you said, turns out to be exactly the opposite of what they should have done. And so we're ending up with an ever bigger mess over there, even while we throw trillions of dollars and waste thousands of American lives and tens of thousands of local lives on wars that don't make any sense and don't end the way we hope they will. And Iran is the biggest example of that. We are picking a fight with them. Whether we have a point, with their nuclear program or not, is almost beside the point we're as far into it as we are, because if we stage a false flag attack or push them into doing something that is real but is really instigated by us or whatever, if we force a war over there and it blocks the flow of oil out of the Middle East, oil will spike to $100 or $150 a barrel, and all the derivatives that are based on oil and interest rates and currencies will blow up. And the global financial system is way too fragile to be guaranteed to survive something like that. We could start a financial crisis that is the one that we've all been looking for, Jay, the big one that finally blows up, the fractional reserve banking, fiat currency world. And this could be it. And we were a few minutes away from that last week when Trump was ready to push the button and stage an attack on Iran, and he pulled back at the last minute, which is a really good decision. But that was just that one thing. There's a really good chance still that we end up in some kind of a shooting war with Iran. And I think the financial consequences of this will be unpredictable, but potentially really, really bad.
Right. Could knock the legs underneath the empire, in essence. I think Trump understands this, certainly. He seems to not want to go into war, but he has all these warmongers, people that make huge amounts of money supporting the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about way back as he was leaving the presidency. So it's really hard to understand. Except I think it's not hard to understand, John, because there's so much money that's made in the military-industrial complex, the high technology. And remember, the government, when it creates money, it has those resources at its disposal first. So it can go out and use those resources and bid them away from the private sector that could be actually doing things that would help humanity. But that's the way it is. And especially since we went off the gold standard in 71, that's, I think, one of the main reasons we did it, so that the military-industrial complex could expand the empire. Nixon couldn't pay for Vietnam and a little bit of socialism to keep the votes coming his way. So we went off the gold standard, and it served the ruling elite very well for several decades, right? But sooner or later, it seems like the piper's going to have to be paid here.
Well, yeah, governments hate anything that constrains their ability to create money out of thin air, because that's the ultimate power, and they love that. And the military-industrial complex definitely wants endless wars because that's how they make their money. So the corporate media that is owned by, in a lot of cases, companies that make money off war, is always beating the drum for us to go in. MSNBC, which is supposedly a left-wing news organization, and CNN, which is middle of the road to the left, are both in favor of this war with Iran that we're starting here.
Very much so.
And that's incomprehensible, except when you think that, okay, war generates news ratings, so they make money that way, and it generates arms sales, so their corporate owners make money. If you look at it from that point of view, it makes complete sense that they're in favor of all these Middle Eastern wars, because that's how they get big year-end bonuses. And it's the perfect excuse for a reimposition of antitrust laws, where we break up the media empires and say, okay, you can only own this many news channels and et cetera. Well, anyhow, hopefully that'll come. Yeah,
John, we're going to have to leave it go at that. It's just we're out of time already. Sorry about that, but we'll have you back on again sometime to continue the discussion. It's certainly owning gold and gold shares is one of the things you need to do, and I don't cheer for higher gold prices. I don't cheer for wars and all kinds of problems so that we can make money with gold, God forbid. But it has to do with the realization of the world as it is and preparing yourself as best you can for it. Thanks for helping us in that regard, John, and we'll look to talk to you again sometime in the near future.